There are some prevailing opinions that believe that the CISO and the CIO sort of own all agency risk, or that they have the means of signing off and accepting on any agency risk pertinent to technology, which in a way makes sense because we are what's referred to as the authorizing officials for these ATO packages. But if you think about it, people engage in risk, I'll call it risky behavior every day. When you're interacting with your email, there could be risk.
Hi, you're listening to The Secure Developer. It's part of the DevSecCon community. Join us June 23rd for DevSecCon 24. It's a free, global, vendor-neutral, community-driven conference that connects developers, security, and operations teams to learn and enable the integration of security into their development practices. Find out more at devseccon.com. This podcast is sponsored by Snyk. Snyk is a dev-first security company, helping companies fix vulnerabilities in their open source components and containers without slowing down development. To learn more, visit snyk.io. SNYK.io. On today's episode, Guy Podjarny, founder of Snyk, talks to Robert Wood. Coming from an established career in the private cybersecurity sector across various startups, Robert felt a calling to public services last year when he joined the Center for Medicare and Medicaid as their Chief Information Security Officer. He is working to make security more accessible for all end users, who include more than just security professionals. One way CMS is doing this is by testing the Batcave to make a more unified approach to software development and cybersecurity.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to The Secure Developer. Today, we're going to dig into the intersection between government and security, and how do we make agile security or sort of modern security approaches work in maybe slightly more challenging surroundings, but ones with all the good intentions. And to really dig into that, we've got with us Rob Wood, who is the Chief Information Security Officer for the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. Rob, thanks for coming on to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So, Rob, before we dig in, tell us a little bit about yourself, and we're going to dig into the Center for Medicare and Medicaid in a bit. What is it that you do, and what was your journey a bit into through the world of security?
Yeah, so right now I am running the security, privacy, and compliance organization at CMS, or the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and that encompasses security, privacy, compliance, of course, agency-wide. So that includes everything from authorizing systems that are going from the development process into production, to managing data privacy sharing agreements, to, of course, just enterprise security operations, or more generally helping foster a culture around security resiliency, to monitoring, to reporting to other agencies, to the White House, to DHS, to managing public-private information sharing. So there's a lot of stuff that goes into it.
Yeah, sounds like it.
But prior to all of this, so I started my career in a super, super small boutique consultancy, I think it was probably 6 people in total, myself included. And I started there as an intern and then converted into a full-time employee. And it was one of those companies that, because it had no HR, no legal, no nothing, there was just a lot of crazy stuff that happened. And the owner of the organization effectively just said yes to anything that was cool and interesting. And so we got to work on a lot of stuff that I don't think I would have had the opportunity to work on in other places, at least not as freely. And so I got exposure really early on to everything from forensics to full scope red teaming, to some application security work, to a lot of, it was very heavy in network security in that particular company. And I mean, we did everything from your bread and butter social engineering to pen testing, to at one point we were doing a physical pen test and we delivered a person inside a Pelican box inside a building, dressed up FedEx garb, the whole 9 yards, and literally shipped him inside. Mm-hmm. It was a lot of fun. And from there, I moved over to Cigital, which is now part of Synopsys. And that was a much bigger, more established, focused on application security consultancy. And so there I got a lot more exposure to I guess, the trade of AppSec. And so everything, again, incorporating pen testing, but also static code analysis and threat modeling and what it means to actually build an AppSec program, to developer engagement and training, to helping CISOs or AppSec directors think about the kind of framework selection they wanted to champion at their organizations, and how they build security controls into developer tools, things along those lines.
Yeah, and this is a consultancy, not audit services
Yes.
so much. Like it's not
Yes,
about
exactly.
finding the issues, but rather working with the leaders to establish programs.
Exactly. And there was a good bit of finding issues, but it wasn't finding issues in an audit sense where it would be going to some regulator. It was,
right,
I need to do a pen test, and so I'm going to engage some firm. I want to make my app, my bank.com app, more resilient, and so I'm going to engage somebody to help. And from there, I was there, started my career at the lower tier of things, just saying yes to everything. And so that's very much been my mantra, just saying yes to things so I could get more exposure and learn more. And I left as a principal and had the opportunity to join a startup in the healthcare space called Nuna. And they were actually working with CMS, building a data warehouse for the Medicaid program at the time. And so I was the first security engineer there, and eventually got asked to help build out an entire security program. So that encompassed both their private sector work, their public sector work, and then of course the corporate security posture. So phishing and security monitoring, things like that.
What was the size of the organization roughly?
Yeah, so when I started, I want to say they were around 60 to 70 people. When I left, it was probably close to 150.
Okay. Yep, just giving a sense of scale. Yeah.
Yep, totally. It was interesting in that case because they were supporting such a big program and working with such big enterprises just by virtue of the thing that they were building. It was interesting because I got sort of thrust into the deep end of enterprise audit and third-party risk reviews and of course the government audit process, which I am now sitting on the other side of. And then from there, I moved over to a security startup called SourceClear. They were purchased by Veracode during my time there, and they were building a software composition analysis tool. And so I got a chance to both run security and be involved in the research part of that product development, and that was really interesting for me. And then I took one more stab at a startup along my journey, and then ended up here. So
yeah, well, quite a journey. So you kind of went consulting. You've done small and now in big.
Yep.
You've kind of gone through growth. So I guess you've got a bit of a variety of experiences to bring to the fore. Know that you're in the big government, but this is the first time actually working for I guess it's fair to call it a government organization, or?
Oh yeah, yep. CMS.gov. We are feds through and through.
So it's still the first experience.
Yes.
in this type of surrounding.
Yep.
Well, so let's dig into this. Again, you've sort of seen big and small. I think kind of the topic we were going to unravel a bit is this potential conflict, and how do we overcome it between maybe a natural risk-averse surrounding as well as one dealing with very sensitive information, healthcare information, and maybe a desire for agility and kind of fast-paced development. How do you keep things secure within that process without bogging everything to a halt? So I think to start exploring this setup, tell us a bit. You already alluded to a little bit, but CMS, like what's the rough structure you work with from a security lens, and especially talking about product organizations or sort of engineering organizations you might be supporting?
Yeah, so the organization layout at CMS is unlike anything I am personally used to. So it's a series of centers, as is in the title. So you have all of these sort of standalone, almost business unit like components around the agency, and they're running various programs. So you've got a center for Medicare, a center for Medicaid. There's another part of the organization that handles enterprise operations and IT, things like that. Another part might handle all the finances. Another part might handle the childhood and insurance program.
And these are dozens of them, hundreds of them? What's the...
Dozens of them. So it's a decentralized agency that all roll up into, of course, the individual who is nominated to run the agency. We sit inside of the Office of Information Technology, my group. And while we sit there, organizationally speaking, we're responsible for security across the agency. And in some cases, some of these teams have their own security teams themselves. And so we would coordinate with them and help them in whatever ways they need, either tooling or support or guidance or information sharing, whatever it is. And some teams or some components or product teams have no security team, have no IT team themselves. They rely on the centralized Office of Information Technology and my group to help them with that. particular part of their day-to-day work. And so some of these parts of the agency are very operational. Others are effectively product development organizations in and of themselves, which is really interesting. And I think that the thing that I've been adjusting to mostly is, in the startup world, you're at a company and everyone's focus at that company is towards building this one product. You're all sort of centered on the same set of goals. I want to get product A out into market. It's got to have a good user experience. It's got to solve problems. It's got to scale. It's got to be secure, all of these things. And so here, everyone is focused on the mission of CMS, but the way in which the means to that end is so different for all of these different programs. And they all have different goals. They all have different levels of technical maturity. They all have different levels of resourcing. And so there's a lot of big enterprise dynamics at play.
Yeah, no, I can imagine the different groups. You provide services, I guess your interaction with these, I guess, effectively business units, right? These different centers. How do you interact with them? You offer services and they're internally charged. How do you work with them?
Yeah, so it's a mix of, there's a lot of services. So everything from penetration testing to the actual, what's referred to as the ATO, or authority to operate process. And that's the final review against the NIST 853 framework that happens in all government agencies before a system goes out the door and it's effectively promoted into production. And we have a division of strategic information that's handling more national security related matters. So they're doing things around supply chain risk management reviews for providers around the agency. And then we also do a lot of things internally. We're building more, I guess you could call them process or products, but they're more a mix of tooling and process together. And that is serving more, we're aggregating information, vulnerability scan information, risk insights, things like that together, and either reporting back out, providing risk reports back out to business owners or system owners. We're providing reports up to DHS or HHS, who is our parent agency, things along those lines.
And how's the accountability split going on there? So you're providing all these different services. Is every center in charge of their own security and you're just there to help, or are you actually kind of in charge of that, I guess?
Yeah, that's a really interesting dynamic. So there's multiple prevailing opinions on that front. So there are some prevailing opinions that believe that the CISO and the CIO sort of own all agency risk, or that they have the means of signing off and accepting on any agency risk pertinent to technology, which in a way makes sense because we are what's referred to as the authorizing officials for these ATO packages. But if you think about it, people engage in I'll call it risky behavior every day. When you're interacting with your email, there could be risk. When you're signing up for a new SaaS tool, there could be risk. When you're writing code, there could be risk. And so everyone is kind of, in every decision that one might make has the potential to introduce or manage risk in some way, shape, or form. And so risk is much more decentralized than it is in the big formal ATO process. But there's a sort of cultural dynamic of risk being this sort of formal thing that needs, like, only certain things rise to the level of getting sign off and tracking and basically coming into my office and being signed by myself and CIO. So there's an interesting dynamic around what is risk, and it's typically viewed as a very negative thing in at least this environment. And from what I understand, other government agencies, and which I think is very justifiable given we're in the business of the government. We do lots of important things on behalf of the American people. And, CMS, for example, has the kinds of things we are responsible for. Like, we have claims data on almost half of the American population, which is a huge amount of people, over 100 million people. And so there's big responsibility. And so the risk aversion, I think, is justifiable. But the interesting thing about that is we've almost created an environment that, because we are so risk averse, we are not changing. And because we are not changing, we're actually taking on more risk, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I think it actually makes a lot of sense. You can't respond to sort of things quickly enough. So I know you've only been there for a fairly short while, right? So about 6
months now. Yeah.
So maybe let's talk about things a little bit more in sort of a future stance, versus necessarily present.
Totally.
So coming along now, you're seeing this risk aversion. How do you approach this challenge? Either what changes you're enacting or ones you're sort of, thinking of. But even before that, like, what do you think is the right way to approach the balance of this justifiable risk and this desire to not freeze?
Yeah. Well, I think part of it means that you need to have security process that is not so painful, that is not painful to the point where you don't want to change because you have to deal with a security process. For example, if I wanted to shift to a container-based deployment strategy, some might constitute that as big, major architectural change. And so in some organizations, security might, kind of swoop in black helicopter style and want to, pick everything apart and want to talk to everyone. They want to look at code. They want to test things. They want to, scan things, blah, blah, blah. And in some, from a developer standpoint, I can understand, that sounds painful. Like I don't actually, even though in this hypothetical circumstance, moving to a container-based deployment strategy might be the optimal technical solution for what I'm building, but having to deal with all of that sounds really painful. And so I don't want to deal with it. And so I'm just not going to do it. I'm going to avoid improving because of the pain that's going to follow. And so I think the first big part is lowering the burden to the point where you're maybe either measuring and performancing or publishing metrics around people's ability to change and react to security or performance telemetry, things along those lines. And so you're effectively trying to invert the decision calculus that people are going through.
What are some concrete sort of tricks, I guess, to achieve that, to invert it? Like what's maybe describe kind of the two scenarios, right? I have an app, I want to use containers.
Yep.
What happens to me in the pre and post world?
Yeah. So a couple of things that at least come to mind for me are we need to find ways to cut down on security process and just like outright remove it where it no longer makes sense. And, I think in the world of change management, we typically focus very heavily on what things we can add. We think about security as a system. We can always add. And anyone who's ever driven in LA knows that having more highways, adding more capacity to a system does not necessarily make it better. And you can actually decrease the throughput of a system by adding more capacity to it, which, sounds counterintuitive, but it's been proven to stand time and time again. So I think security teams looking introspectively at the things that they don't need to be doing that are not actively moving the needle, and cutting away those things or consolidating them, making them simpler, whatever that looks like, I think is a really important first step. Another big step is trying to find a way to force more accountability and ownership over risk. And so what I mean by that is if I'm working on a new product and I want to get it out the door, my mindset is that somebody else is basically going to have the egg on their face if this goes wrong, not me, not my team. Then I may be a little bit more flippant. But if I'm taking a more active ownership over the fact that like, hey, I want to move from traditional servers to containers and have everything bundled and running Kubernetes or whatever my shiny new idea is for improving my product. And I've done the research. I can lay it all out. I have data to back up the fact that this is a well-reasoned, well thought out plan. And I put it out there. I'm a big proponent of making sure that decisions are localized to where they are going to be most effectively made. Who's going to have the best data to make the decision? And effectively, you're almost transferring the risk down to the individuals or the teams that are going to be best suited to make the decision. And that, I think, has to come from some level of leadership where they are comfortable decentralizing or delegating authority to accept risk or take more chances and embrace opportunity as risk, opportunity being the inverse of risk. It's a combination. You almost need both sides to kind of meet in the middle of teams being willing to embrace that role and leaders being willing to give up that role. And so that is something that we are actively trying to do right now and getting more people to, like, for example, we have one of the NIST controls centers around doing something called a security impact analysis. And traditionally, security impact analysis has been thought of as doing a lightweight controls assessment. So if I want to do, quote unquote, a major change to a system, one might have to go through and basically do a mini audit every time I want to do a major change. And if you're thinking about that in the context of a continuous deployment operating model, where you're trying to deploy even once a day and doing a mini controls assessment every single time that you're making a change, and making sure that's all documented and signed off on is painful. And so, ideally, if I were to combine these two concepts as it applies to the SIA, or the security impact analysis, then it's worth thinking about, is that actually moving the needle on risk? Can we boil that down to what the essence of it really is? Whether it's doing a very quick time box threat model on what the change is going to be, making sure that you are de-risking the change through good unit test coverage and maybe security linting or software composition analysis, or you have a certain set of security activities that are adequately de-risking changes you're making to your product. And then separately, I don't need to look at your SIA, being the CISO. I have no idea what it is you're changing. I am in no way equipped to sign off on or make a good decision about the change that you're making to your product. And so you, being the product owners and developers, and maybe a security person who's working with you, you all should be making the decision on whether this change you're making or proposing to make is the right move. You should have the backing, the resources, the data to support you making that decision. And then I'm just going to back you up.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And you're right to say that it requires both sides. So this is the central entity, your group in this context, relinquishing some control.
Yep.
But you can't just sort of drop it to the ground. Somebody else needs to sort of pick that up. So the centers or the business units picking that up and saying, okay, the ball's in our court, but then they can choose whether they actually apply that process or do they apply some reduced variant of it.
Yep.
Who within the centers, so you mentioned, or a security person, I mean, in your view of how this gets rolled out, does it rely on local security experts residing within the groups to achieve this? Is this more of a security champion style, or is it people with an actual security title? How do you see the expertise required to be able to take on such responsibility?
Yeah, I'm a big proponent of the security champions model. So right now, there is a role referred to as an ISSO, or Information System Security Officer. This is a pretty standard thing across the federal space, and it's effectively the individual within a product team that's been named to have security responsibilities for a product area. Or a system can kind of get used pretty broadly. Sometimes a data center environment can be classified as a system, or AWS account might be classified as a system. A SaaS account might be classified as a system or product. And in some cases here, those ISSOs, they are bread and butter security people. Like, they know their stuff in and out. If you want to talk threat modeling with them, you can. If you want to talk static analysis with them, you can. They can interpret pen test findings. They can roll up their sleeves. But in some cases, those roles are almost like an other duties as assignment for an individual. And in those cases, it might be a nurse, or it might be an admin of sorts, and they may not have any security experience whatsoever. And so in those cases, we need to rely on other individuals with technical expertise close to the product, or support them with technical resources of our own, either through contractor support or our team, and effectively get them the help that they need. Because if they're operating effectively flying blind without any kind of security expertise, then that makes their job way, way harder. And understandably, they're going to be nervous about making changes, or effectively putting their name on a change that says, I'm okay with this, the named ISSO, even though they may not understand anything that's going into it. And so they may feel like they're putting their neck on the line for something that they don't understand, which I deeply empathize with. And so I think in the ideal case, you'd have a combination of the ISSO being the more like a product security architect, and then you'd have more of a security champion relationship with engineers who are actually resident on the product teams, those who are actually contributing code and can be an advocate for security. So you'd have a tight relationship between the ISSO and a champion inside of a product team. And when and where it makes sense, coordinating back with the central, with the mothership, so to speak,
to get support. Yeah.
Receiving new sort of guidance or support or funding or tooling or, things like that.
Yeah. I actually really like this concept. I haven't heard of an information system security officer of this ISSO, but I like it. Like the thought that comes to mind is this GM model, for instance, which in most organizations, a GM is a very big thing. You're a general manager of something big, but for example, in the AWS model, it can be a very small thing. You can be a GM of something very small, and your seniority, I guess, or demonstrated competence in the role as it evolves, then the scope of your responsibility. But this is a very clear ownership, even if not a clear skill set, to say this is your responsibility to be the security officer of whatever system that is, big or small.
Yep.
And then I guess the rest of the organization needs to be set up to help you actually accomplish this successfully. But it is very clear ownership, which has a lot of appeal to it, and kind of a flavor of actually very modern methodologies, or that if that was multiplied within the centers and into sort of smaller and smaller units, then those units actually can be quite empowered in this model.
Right. And typically or historically, that role has effectively been almost like the compliance officer for a given system. But in some of our more mature centers or technically mature products where the ISSO maybe has more security experience, and the product teams, they're on a continuous deployment sort of operating model. They're really like truly building product. Those teams, you really see this. I'm going to use a cheesy corporate buzzword here, but you really see this cool synergy between development and operations and security. And not to like drop a buzzword on it, but it really is like the embodiment of DevSecOps in a way where you've got everyone in that product bubble taking ownership over the quality of the thing that they're bringing into the world. And then we're just kind of engaging with them and sort of feeding them new stuff as it comes out, or listening to them as they are dealing with their own sort of challenges. So we have a couple of outlets for collecting information from the ISSO community and just the security community at CMS at large, and trying to really be introspective and listen to what it is that's bothering people, what's getting in their way, what's not working for them, things like that. So we can find out what things we need to streamline, what things we need to cut away, what things we need to add, things like that.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting concept. Always you look at high accountability surroundings. Hopefully we can control the amount of blame that sort of might naturally sort of lead with it, but still sort of high accountability surroundings. And it's interesting to think about that model. And it is a bit of an intermediate model or entity between the security champion, the potential CISO, which is by definition quite large because it needs to be a business unit, and maybe something a bit smaller.
Yeah.
How do you find your allies in this context? So you gave an example here of NIST, but as you embark on a change in the organization to apply more local accountability, to relinquish, how do you find who to work with? Do you try to instill this broadly sweeping, or do you find pilots and you practice there? What's your approach?
So I think this is very much a matter of personal preference. So my approach is very much centered on a combination of the last two approaches that you brought up. So experimentation with different ideas. By no stretch do I think I have all the good ideas, and I don't think anyone has all the good ideas. And so we try to create a culture of openness such that people can bring forward ideas. We can collectively sort out which of those might stand out as good candidates to run, and then try them out. Try them out in a very localized way, collect data, see what works. If it doesn't work, that's okay. But then separately, I am, having worked in product companies myself during my time in startups, and this was a big mindset change for me. So like when I was consulting, you kind of have this mindset of, I'm just going to come in and find things. It's going to get shipped over to somebody else, and they're going to, it's their problem. You can almost recommend anything as a consultant. And I've observed this now being out of the consulting world where
no accountability, it comes back to that.
Yeah, there's no accountability. You don't own the pain and suffering. Like if you were to recommend, change the parent site scope of your session cookie on some app, and the consultant may not know that particular setting is tied to some big like enterprise architecture thing. And you're basically like putting people in this rock and a hard place where they have to they're left with this report, and they're then, sitting there trying to argue with other people across the organization and make it happen. And so when I came into my first product company role, and I really had to kind of change the way that I thought, such that, if I'm going to make a recommendation, I better be willing to roll up my sleeves and help make it happen alongside everybody else. And so bringing that into CMS, and to round out the question. So I really try to, like, anybody who is willing to step up and willing to share their thoughts and share their feelings and wants to make security better, I seek them out as allies in making this happen. Because, like the whole cliche of security is everyone's job is, I think, true to an extent, but it's security culture, or culture in general, is definitely everybody's job. And anyone who wants to be a positive contributor to helping make that better, like, I carve out the time to listen and work with them and hear their suggestions and offer my own back, and basically collaborate with them at a localized level, and then bring it back into the office and the reach that we have in our group to try to take those recommendations and basically funnel them into these experiments that we might run across the agency. And so it's a combination of just having a good ground game, relationship building and listening, and an experimentation to figure out what's going to work.
Yeah. So maybe let's take a moment to talk about the other side. So the compliance, or sort of the auditors, or even sometimes it's yourself with sort of the authority to operate.
Yep.
How do you accept, or how do you get, when you talk to sort of, other auditors or such, to kind of wrap their heads around and kind of bless a surrounding in which you reduced controls and you've given people who might not have fully practiced it, fully documented it, or sort of, quite as mature in handling it, the responsibility for it?
So that's a nut that we have not yet cracked, admittedly. And my hypothesis at the moment is, historically, everything is kind of centered around controls assessments. And so if you have gaps in your controls, that's a bad thing. And ergo, you have risk, and ergo, it might not make sense to give you an ATO and sort of let your product out into the world to do what it was meant to do. And my hypothesis is that we need to instead of focusing so much on controls, because controls cover everything from session timeouts to paperwork to the way you manage personnel. Anyone who's been through any kind of like SOC 2 audit or ISO 27000 audit, or PCI, HIPAA, that controls span. They span the whole organization. Yeah. And not all controls are the same. Encrypting your data at rest might not be the same as having antivirus installed. Like, what if my organization's running on Chromebooks? Does antivirus make sense? Right? Probably not. If I've chosen to adopt a continuous authentication, like passwordless biometric authentication scheme, where I'm using Face ID or YubiKeys or something like that, then having strong passwords, like, that control doesn't make sense. So I think instead we need to shift towards this position of measuring and reporting on positive security activities, with the understanding that positive security activities result in resilient security outcomes. It might not just be security activities. It might be good development culture. It might be good change management culture, things along those lines they kind of intersect with security in useful ways. And so sort of blending what controls are actually most important, and is your team exhibiting positive security activities such that the more of those you do, we know, if you're doing software composition analysis, you're doing static analysis, you run pen tests every so often, you engage with your developers, you have developer-led threat modeling, you have a good change management process, you're practicing infrastructure as code. Like, wow, your product is probably not going to be all that bad, versus somebody who might have all their controls squared away, but is still manually changing things in production. They've got humans in production accounts, messing around with configuration, and they're racking and stacking more servers to scale things. And that latter system probably has a lot more risk. And so I would like to change where we are authorizing based on risk, such that risk is derived from some measure of what controls are present that matter most, and what security activities you are doing, such that we can infer positive outcomes, if that makes sense.
It makes a lot of sense. And I like the approach. I guess, is it now a work in progress to get
total work in progress
auditors on board then to sort of accept it's a directional to go from black and white to sort of, are we practicing? It's almost like auditing your progress versus necessarily the local outcome.
Exactly. Because right now the ATO process, you effectively, and this is per NIST, you go through an initial ATO, you audit against 100% of your controls. And then every year you do a third of those controls. And then every 3 years you do the full ATO again. And so, for teams that are changing a lot more rapidly than once a year, that are practicing more agile development as opposed to your traditional waterfall development, an annual review just doesn't really cut it. It doesn't really help. It gets in the way more so than it helps.
Right.
And so we need to find a way, I think, to measure the things that are going to protect a system year round continuously, infrastructure as code or other good security practices. And those are the things that are going to give us a sense of good risk management year round and continuously, as opposed to having an auditor look at a set of controls and paperwork once a year.
At a point in time. Makes sense. Rob, thanks for sharing, lots of good nuggets here all around, basically this revolving around this notion of like distributing the security responsibility and kind of all the adapting that needs to happen around it. Before I kind of let you go over here, one last question. So all of this was, sort of past and present. Let's kind of cast our eyes to the future a little bit further out. If you took out your crystal ball and you thought of someone doing your job in 5 years' time, what would you say would be most different about their reality?
Yeah, I think it's more and more likely that the job of a CISO in the future is more akin to managing a data platform. And so, security telemetry is only going to increase. We're only going to get it more frequently and more like streaming data as opposed to these point in time sort of snapshots of data. And it's almost like a chief data officer crafting intelligence out of this massive data that we're getting on an ongoing basis. And if I was to think about security as a big data platform and all of these things sort of dumping into this data lake or data warehouse, whatever sort of way in which you're set up, I'm able to craft, or the CISO of the future is able to craft intelligence out of all of that and then share it out to produce intelligence products back to the people who need to be accountable for it, closer to the point where they need to make a decision on it. Then that, I think, is really, it's a game changer for instilling this sense of ownership and accountability in the way one might manage risk. And I think that brings in the need for data science talent in this field, and not just, building machine learning models to like triage stock alerts or find malware, things like that. But it's really making sense out of this massive data that we sit on, because typically we have all of these security activities that stovepipe themselves. They all sort of operate as a standalone thing, or they just generate a report. They generate insights, but they don't generate data that can then go and be connected to something else to generate even more valuable insights. And so it's almost like thinking about security as a platform or security in a network effects sort of way. And that's my hunch. I hope that's where we're going, or at least some flavor of it, because I really believe that there's a lot of power in taking that approach, because our field hasn't really embraced the sort of big data revolution, so to speak, like other fields have. Marketing's got it on lockdown. Other fields have, but we really haven't yet. And, if and when we do, I think there's a lot of opportunity in there for us.
Yeah, no, fully agreed. Security is naturally invisible, and you don't really know what risk you're taking on. So shining a spotlight there and understanding what is there with sort of smart data management makes a lot of sense. So we're out of time here. Rob, thanks a lot for coming onto the show and for sharing your insights.
Of course. Yeah, it was my pleasure. And thank you for having me.
And thanks everybody for tuning in. And I hope you join us for the next one.
Thanks for listening to The Secure Developer. That's all we have time for today. To find additional episodes and full transcriptions, visit thesecuredeveloper.com. If you'd like to be a guest on the show or get involved in the community, find us on Twitter at @DevSecCon. Don't forget to leave us a review on iTunes if you enjoyed today's episode. Bye for now.